Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Thank you for joining us for yet another Facebook live sessions. This is a continuation of a series of lectures by two of our speakers. That would be Dr. Faris Hajamaidin and also Faizan Shah. The topic is on the history and theory of architectural Islam, the body, image, and spirit of place. So last week we had a very interesting and engaging session. At the end of today's lecture as well, you can ask your questions. So if you have any questions, you can send them to +65 8776 7706. That's +65 8776 7706. Right. Dr. Faris Hajamaidin is director of the School of Architecture and the Built Environment at the Singapore Polytechnic, where he has been teaching history and theory of ideas since 2002. He completed his master's degree at McGill University School of Architecture and his PhD at the University of Adelaide's Center for Asian and Middle Eastern Architecture. His main research interest has been the study of the human body as a site for architectural imaginings, with a special focus on the relationship between Vitruvius's De Architectura and Platonic philosophy. Recently, he has studied the relationship of body and building in the works of the 12th century Muslim illuminationist Ishraqi Shihab al-Din al-Surawardi. He has written, taught, and presented invited talks on this topic. Our second guest for tonight is Faizan Shah, who is a lecturer and year coordinator at Singapore Polytechnic's Diploma in Interior Design. He leads the Generative Design Atelier and he teaches history and theory of ideas in a course 3 years inside this course, and he completed his bachelor's in architectural design at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, RMIT Australia, and Master of Architecture at Universitat Innsbruck in Austria. He developed interests in the complexities of engaging architecture with a focus on poetical and representational through history, through theory and the instruments of perception. And again, if you do have any questions, you can send them to the number that we've listed in the comments below. Without further ado, we'd like to invite Dr. Faris and Faizan Shah to begin. Bismillah.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi barik sallam. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh. So again, thank Sudi Ilahi for giving me this opportunity, me and Faizan, this opportunity to share some of our ideas. If anything, we are students of whatever we are presenting. So we should always start with thanks and gratitude. Last week, there were really wonderful comments from people who joined in, and they sent me some notes, including a former student. That was very nice. Thanks for joining in last week, and if you're continuing today, thanks for joining in, and hopefully this would be of some benefit. If there are others who have joining in new, I also hope this would be of some interest to you. At the end of the day, at least for me, it's a journey where I would like to learn as well from the comments you give, and this tends to be ongoing research. This is a two-parter of my presentation for this series. But before I begin, I want to apologize. My training is in architecture, architecture histories, architecture theories. I'm well versed with Renaissance histories and theories, pre-modern philosophies in the Western tradition, and somewhat in the Islamic tradition as well, but I'm by no means an expert. And today I'm going to delve into aspects of our faith with regards to prayer and of great scholars, of hadith literature, in fact, of which again, I'm making reference to, I am leaning on other scholars who have commented on it, but I just want to put it up front that I'm not an Islamic scholar in that sense. So if there's some deficiencies, I seek understanding, and if you can fill in the gaps, please do so, and I'm thankful for it. So I'll just continue on with where I left off last week. The topic is on spatial geometry of prayer. And if I could do a quick recap, what we were trying to, I think perhaps take off from the runway we were, is to really think about whether in our tradition, which does not seem to have had any authorship of architectural theories, whether architectural theories can be found in other aspects, right? May it be in the Quran, may it be in the prophetic hadith. And I shared some examples of where architectural ideas could be found in the works of our great scholars and also philosophers. And this is a key area, a key point that last week I ended my lecture in with, where the Prophet's hadith of the earth has been made sacred and pure and a mosque for me. So whenever the time of your prayer comes for anyone of you, he should pray wherever he is. I think if you analyze this hadith quite carefully, it allows us to consider potentiality of body in prayer as an architectural site. Or at least that's how I am positing it. And perhaps via studying the body in prayer, we can challenge conventional thinking and understanding what architecture in itself is, outside of the traditional views of how we view and experience architecture as a building with materials and particular type of vocabularies. And I also brought into play elements of how this space can appear, this building, body in prayer, can appear and disappear, conditioned to a space-time matrix. So quickly, the three boundaries I introduced last week to help us shape our thinking that the act of prayer or setting ourselves up for prayer in itself can be contemplated as an architectural site. I drew the notion of our positioning in relationship to the Kaaba, which is directional. Architecture tends to be oriented and it responds to particular condition. And how our activity of Salah has got to do with time. And in the daily prayer, it has mostly got to do with the sunrise to the last light with Isha. So there is a conditioning that we need to become aware of to start thinking about the body in prayer as an architectural site. Last but not least is the inviolable space that we structure, that appears when we stand up to pray, marked by the sutra, where someone should be resisted if you're trying to cut across. So this is just an opening statement I made. And I think I perhaps kind of stopped here last week. And I was trying to utilize the work by Samar Akash, this text called Cosmology and Architecture in Pre-Modern Islam, an architecture reading of mystical ideas. Akash is really interested, or was at that time very interested in the writings of Ibn Arabi, and especially the Futuhat. And he too wanted to discover the speciality of prayer from sources other than, in the absence of architectural theories. And in a significant part of the book, he actually focused on how the body's posture during Salah in prayer can inform us to think geometrically, and by extension of it also the idea of architecture. So when we consider the spatial geometry of prayer, and here I would like to reference, and there are many works to reference, and I've stuck with Al-Ghazali here. Ghazali, and I'm using the Mukhtasar, which is the abridged version of the Ihya. He starts to describe how the body should be positioned in prayer, and he describes the key aspects of prayer, and we should pay attention to the vocabulary in trying to form architectural ideas. So he starts by talking about Qiyam. He starts with the standing posture, and he says that this must be performed absolutely upright and without any sort of imbalance. The weight of the body should be equally distributed on both feet, he says. So one is expected to face the Kaaba strictly without fidgeting, not turning to the left or the right. So what we have here is a firmly established verticality, and if I may say so, an upward thrust, right? You're standing up for prayer. And the next posture is the Roko, which is bowing. He describes the ruku as the worshipper locks the knees upright, straightens the back, neck and head, that they are like one horizontal plane. There's a kind of straightness to it. So that's the ruku. And in sujud, everything is forced downwards. Right? The posture of prostration grounds the body downward, ensuring 7 main bodily parts are in contact with the ground. Right? So the term used is it drops into prostration, and the negotiation or the conversation with the ground is at the firmest at the point of sujud. So there's a strong way of expressing that this is a downward movement. And the notion of julus, which is sitting and resting, he describes it. He raises his head, the person in prayer, from prostration. He sits, coming to a rest. And then this is a moment that is described as, again, the moment of rest is without keeping the fingers too tight. There's a kind of relaxation, but you've come to a moment of stopping. So these are the general, perhaps, phases of the prayer. And if I may then try to translate it just using what we have read from Ghazali as a kind of directional notation. Perhaps this is how prayer can be simply, described as movement, right? If we make an abstraction out of it, the upwards, the horizontal, the downwards, the rest. So Samar Akash, in his text, he takes it to the next stage, and I would like to read how he has interpreted the reading I just presented. Islamic prayer comprises a prescribed set of gestures and recitations performed in the same way individually or collectively while standing at a fixed point in space. It involves series of bodily postures rhythmically repeated in one place with no processional rituals. There are 4 postures: standing, bowing, sitting or resting, and prostrating. So this is the last part we should concentrate on. The movements associated with these bodily postures reveal 4 tendencies: upward associated with the standing posture, the horizontal associated with the bowing posture, downward associated with the prostrating posture, and stillness associated with the resting posture. And then Samar goes one further move with these directional ideas that we've translated into some simple illustration, a graph. And then he translated in the following manner. The upward movement unfolds the upper part of the body. And then he draws this. The downward movement unfolds the lower part of the body, sujud. And then he speaks about the outward movement unfolds the body in 4 directions. This is covering the 4-fold of the horizon. So in this manner, he translates the idea of the body in prayer with this structure, and the center being the point of rest, which we spoke about. And then, this is how he kind of converts it. And he goes on to explain that if you really meditate upon the geometry or the geometricization of a prayer, in fact, we can start to see a type of spatiality that is coming to view. He calls it the 3-dimensional cross, which in itself has 6 sides. And the 6 sides simply tells us of the cube form. And those listening in, if you're really interested, if you read his text, this is one fundamental idea he finds continually repeated in the writings of many thinkers, and I will be sharing with you on this quite shortly as well. So this is an idea which he unpacks of the body in prayer. So if we kind of try to make some connections here, is this the geometry of the prayer that we have arrived at, right? So we started with the posture of the body in prayer. We gave it some orthography, and then it kind of got translated into the 6-dimensional cross. And the cross is in fact a cuboid. And I mentioned this last week. there's some sort of resonance or mirroring that continues to tie the prayer to the source that it is facing towards. It's not explicitly said, but if you think through where Akash is leading us into, the cube is facing a cube formula, and then there's some repetition about it, and perhaps the notion of the six sides and the cube has certain perhaps imperative or importance in our tradition. Um, and this is where I'll take the next part of my talking to. Right? So I'm no Ibn Arabi expert, but in my researches, again, Akash was actually my PhD supervisor, and his influence and his guidance has led me to, uh, find from Ibn Arabi how this constant idea of the six-sidedness as a kind of a complete negotiation of space. There's a comprehensiveness about it, and it kind of connects many layers with which we can understand prayer, the body, the beginning of the cosmos, the structure of the cosmos, and eventually with the Kaaba. Right? So I just want to quickly share with you uh, through the writings of Ibn Arabi, how he may have meditated on the six dimensions, how he may have meditated on the human body, on the body in prayer. And this is so interesting. In the Fusus, Ibn Arabi writes, the prayer as the world is conveyed from non-existence into existence by virtue of an intelligible motion, which is the movement in the prayer, comprises all motions, which are three. Upright motion, which is when the praying person stands, a horizontal motion, which is when the praying person bows, and a downward motion, which is when he prostrates. The next bit is important to capture. He says the motion of man is upright. And this is very important, right? Upright, the verticality of human beings is he could see up, and there's a connection in that verticality between man tied to the earth and the heavens. And he speaks about the motion of the animals as horizontal. There's an animality in human beings as well. So that could be found in many Sufic readings as well. And the motion of the plants is downward, right? That's because plants draw their food from the ground and they're rooted to the ground. And in themselves, inanimate objects have no motions at all. If anyone has any kind of readings of traditional cosmology, with one swoop, Ibn Arabi covers all sorts of existences, which is the rational human, the animals, and the plants, and the world of plants, and also the minerals or the rocks that don't move. And the entire idea that the human being is the microcosm, and within the human being you find the how do I say this? The image of the entire cosmos. The man is microcosm of the entire cosmos, right? So this is very interesting where he has brought the notion of the entirety of the cosmos, which is the beginning of his quotation, prayer as the world is conveyed from non-existence to the existence. So he's almost trying to describe, if you have contemplated on the geometry of the body in prayer, you may understand yourself and how you are structured across the spectrum of all beings, right? He's addressing human beings in a sense. So with this, I think we are at a nice place to talk about how Ibn Arabi considers the structure of the cosmos in itself. And and the terms used are very wonderful, right? If one wanted to visualize all there is as a whole. So while you're reading his text, he's asking you to have an image in front of you. And the visualize the all here is in the entirety of the creation, or at this point, at least at the beginning of the creation. And the text I'm referring to here is the Tree of Being, the Shajarat al-Kaum, where he writes, if one wanted to visualize all there is as a whole, everything that came into existence and what caused them all to be, and their doings and their sayings and their lives and their states. So this is broader than the four categories we just observed with man, animal, plant, and minerals. What better similitude there for seeing this than a tree? So again, he's asking you to visualize the tree of being, right? And it's really poetical what he says here, generating from a single divine seed. Uh, I'll be unflashing this over these next few slides. So keep in mind this single divine seed, which is tied to the divine command of the kun as being the center, right? Think of this as a center. And he unfolds the structure of the universe, or the spine of the universe that sets up this architecture of the cosmos in such a way. He says, first, three shoots grew from the center, the sacred seed of that tree. One went to the right, the other to the left. And that's the horizon, which we have spoken about just now, even with prayer. And the third shoot grew tall, upwards. And he says the tree of being grew, reaching the far heavens. So the verticality is, it's infinite in a sense, right? Its lower branches became the worlds of matter. So there is also a downward force here. Now, to emphasize the structure that he has spoken of so poetically, he brings an architectural way of thinking about this. He encloses this idea by saying, the tree of being is protected within a wall that surrounds it on its right, on its left, on its front, the back, the above, and the beneath. So I'll leave it at that, right? So I hope you start to see the resonances of the connections from where I left off with the structure of prayer. And all good things and all important things obviously references to the Prophet. Everything references back to the Prophet, right? And Ibn Arabi here talks about the Prophet, central locus in the cosmogenesis. And he says, when the one who was planting the tree of being first squeezed the quintessence out of its seed, become purer than the purest, he shone upon it the light of wisdom. It became alive. From it, he created the light of our Prophet. This light is the origin. Again, consider this as being that center I started this conversation with. The source of all and everything that comes into being. It's encompassing, right? It's really quite kind of an expansive statement that he's saying here. Next bit, Ibn Arabi now talks about the construction of the Adamic body, the body of Adam, and its resemblance to the cosmic model. The cosmic model we spoke about is six-dimensional, and look at how he describes the body of Adam. God made Adam to have 6 directions. Above, what is near his head, below, facing him near his feet. Right, what is near his strong side, left, facing him, what is his weak side, in front, and what is before his neck, back. And he formed him and proportioned him and evened him out. So this is just to make a connection between the macrocosm and the microcosm. So there is a relationship between how the cosmos was made and how the human being is made. I just want to digress here. So this is, this is a really fascinating, conversation, that Ibn Arabi brings to attention. So slight digression. So please indulge me. He speaks about how the Prophet is the generator of all human form, right? And this is really beautiful. He says the created creation. God created the creation for the sake of Muhammad, and in his shape. The shape of Adam and his children is created in the form of Muhammad. The roundness of their head comes from the Arabic meme. The 2 hands hanging down from each side are in the form of the ha. The belly is like the second meme, and the legs spread apart is from the Arabic dal. I do not know whether this is exactly the diagram he intended. There is no diagram I have seen. If anyone else has, please contact me. And this is to my ability how I drew it out. I put this down here because there could be those who are listening in who could be thinking of some research topics, and there is a rich vein within the Ibn Arabi text of looking into words, alphabets in Arabic, and trying to really build a whole other second layer of vocabulary, which is physical and also metaphysical. And I'm going to come into that very soon about thinking about the construct of the world and the human. Next is Ibn Arabi and how the rest of the creation is but a duplicate of the Prophet ﷺ's body and soul. So think about the Prophet's centrality in the creation of the entire cosmos. And this just blows us away, right? Now think of how the rest of the creation is but a duplicate of his body and soul. For there is not a single universe but two. One is the universe of matter and the other is the spiritual universe, the visible and the invisible. The Prophet ﷺ's body became the model for the visible world. How are we to imagine this, right? And the spiritual realms were inspired by his blessed soul. So the density and the weight of things in this lower world are the weight of his material existence amongst us. This is a really comprehensive way of tying, the existence of the Prophet to the entire, every other existence kind of contained within him. And it connects back to Ibn Arabi's initial conversation of how the cosmos came into being with the nur or the light of the Prophet being in its center. And the rest of the quotation is here. He speaks about a kind of a mystic geography that he builds, and then he continually is tying this image to the image of the Prophet. And the next is an unfolding of Ibn Arabi for us to better understand and appreciate what he means by the center of the Prophet and how he's going to connect the notion of the light. So remember this. I go back to the quote and I reread this quote. When the one who was planting the tree of being first squeezed the quintessence out of its seed, it was made to become purer than the purest. He shone upon it the light of wisdom. He shone upon it the light of wisdom. It became alive. From it, he created the light of our Prophet. This light is the origin, the source of all things. And I think I've shared with you several quotes from Ibn Arabi that emphasizes and re-emphasizes this idea in so many different ways. But then he takes it to the idea of the alphabet and soon to geometry. So what he says is quite interesting, and this is my writing actually on the right. In relation to understanding the Prophet as the source of creative light, Ibn Arabi draws our attention to the Arabic word for light, nur, the last letter of the word kun, be. So the first letter of nur and the last letter of kun is kind of like synthesized, right, or soldered together. And he says the letter nun is written as a semicircle, right, with a dot in the middle. In his Futuhat, he writes, in the very way the letter nun is written, it is a hemisphere, right? It's a semicircle. The first sign of the spiritual and intelligible nun can be seen in the nun's dot. So without us placing the dot, the nun cannot appear, right? And he says, as it stands over the lower part of the letter, which is half of the circumference. So he talks about, perhaps to better understand this, we almost have to unfold the nun, right? So I just to re-emphasize here, the first sign of the spiritual intelligible nun circle is the dot, and then he does this, right? So you were to think of this as a circle, as we do with geometry, and then he draws the line and puts the dot of the nun, and then the diameter is measured by an alif, which is a straight line. In calligraphy, as far as I know, the proportion of all letters is measured against the alif, right? The alif is the verticality. This is the beginning. So again, there are many layers here to unpack. I don't have time. But if we think of this in a geometric fashion, to actually conceive this center point, you have to intersect the circle, which is the kind of the basis with which the nun would appear, with the two axes of the alif. So once the two axes cut, you have the dot, and now you can engineer or you can reveal the nun to come about. This is obviously a kind of a translation on interpretation, which I make. Right? So if you think about this, the noon is a circle whose intelligibility comes about with the intersection of alif, marking its centers. It's essentially a circle with its center made prominent. So think of the noon as a circle. And this whole idea of creating the circle and the compass and the center line being very important. Again, when we look at our scholars, there is an emphasis of the compass, the drawing of the circle and the middle point and connecting it back to the Prophet. So even when great sages are speaking from different space and time, there's a kind of connection in the way they think about these things. And that is very instructive. And this is a lovely quote from the 12th century Sufi Mansur Samarani. This is found in William Chittick's book, Divine Love. A sultan needs a throne, and the throne must have a place and location. The place and location needs a courtyard. There's so much architecture there already. The world with all this spaciousness is the courtyard for the throne of Muhammad, God's messenger. God's messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is the center point of the circle drawn by the compass. When someone has a compass, it has two legs. When he wants to draw a circle, he makes one leg firm. The firmer it is, the more beautifully it turns. Now, the next quotation, all beauty is the trace of my center point. I believe it is a hadith, but he does not make any reference. And then he goes on to write, I place one leg of the compass at the Muhammadan center and I turn the other around the sphere. So the cosmogenesis or the beginning of the cosmos, at its center, we see the Prophet appearing again. And somehow or other now the relationship with noon, the compass, the circle, and the axis has been found. So if I turn the text into geometry, it will look like what I just described. But then we can't look at it in two dimensions because as we have been talking about, the Prophet's geometry is encompassing. It needs to be flipped into 3 dimensions in all dimensions, right? So when we flip this 2 dimension to 3 dimensions, it goes back into our initial discussion of the 3-dimensional cross, which informs us of the cuboid form again. So there's a kind of a repetition, and there are many links that are forming up. We started with the notion of the prayer, the notation of that, we then moved through the human body, how the cosmos was generated, but now we are coming back to a point perhaps where we started from. So that's a kind of an extended way of looking at the ideas of prayer, and it's not as simple as it is. Right? If just by contemplating on the geometry of prayer, we can think about our relationship with the Prophet's relationship with the beginnings of the cosmos, our relationship with the Kaaba, our relationship of how to even think about our body. So there's so many layers. And it's always said that good architecture actually orientates you in a way to think about yourself, right? I'll conclude by some thoughts I have about how to perhaps study even the congregational prayer. So when the time for congregation comes, the beginning or the kind of a marker point of this is in the front, which is the Imam. And the Imam's position is actually the orientation or link between, for us, as a kind of direction to where the Kaaba is. So the Imam actually is a compass point for us to point to the direction of the Kaaba. So that's point number 1. So once the Imam has assumed his position, the congregation forms rows behind him, and there is a rhythm to it. It moves to the right, then to the left, and it starts to build widthwise. And as it is growing widthwise, it also starts to expand in length. So again, in a 2-dimensional reading, you start to see the axis forming again. And I just want to quote a hadith here. Keep the Imam in the center and fill in the opening space. The front rows are said to be the most blessed, as they are the rows in which the angels are joined in. The hadith is keep the Imam in the center and fill opening the space. Uh, and there is a certain order and a certain thinking or privileging about how spaces are formed and the meaning and the weight given to the rows. So the preference is to the front, and then you form to the right, to the left, and you form backwards. And then in this way, the congregation prayer, the way the saf is set up, starts to also inform us and also unfold space. Tip the Imam, and then right, left, and then going backwards. And then when we are all arranged, there is now an emphasis for us to stand straight in the row. So the structuring or the horizontality is established. So that's when we straighten the saf. And again, this goes back to the prophetic tradition of ensuring, how bodies are arranged. And this is very critical, right? And it's so important that whenever we stand up for prayer, the notion that we should set ourselves to be straight in the saf is always mentioned. So it is continually respecting the notion of the horizontality or the straightness of the row. And then the emphasis of the horizontality is made to reappear again when we are told to ensure there is no gap between us and the next person praying. And traditionally, this used to be by having a presence at your shoulders, right? And then someone standing close, and you can feel them. And even if you're not touching, there's someone to your right and someone to the left. And because you got to go down in prostration, you got to understand the space in front of you. And you also have to ensure that you're standing straight, you look behind to see the space behind you. And you also want to be conscious that you are not cramping the space behind you so the person can pray comfortably. What I'm coming to is, in just the arrangement of your body in the congregation, you start to understand yourself as a vertical body. You understand the space in front of you and behind you. And to stand straight, the body's at the side of you, and where your feet is positioned ensures that you're also stood in the horizontality. All in all, as you stand in prayer and congregation, the notion of the sick side gets even more emphasized through ways of measure and also through resistance, right? Perhaps maybe, and I'm concluding here, the prayer form is a kind of a dhikr. It's a kind of a remembrance. And I don't want to belabor here. And I've shown how thinking about it even geometrically connects us into so many realms of existence, connection to the prophet, beginning of the cosmos, towards our own body in itself. And this is deep. This shows the amazing tradition we have, where a thing that seems so simple as movement in Salah can actually open up a wide vista for us to appreciate multiple dimensions of our existences, right? So we started from here, we build up into this, we considered this, and it repeated itself. And last but not least, we end with the Kaaba, which in itself has other histories and stories to be told. And perhaps I'll conclude with this. In Ibn Arabi's writing, I don't have the reference here. He says, when the body of Adam was made, the angels brought to God the earth from all over the world, right? From all the directions of the world. But when it came to making the body of the prophet, the earth was collected from the Kaaba itself. So somehow or other, there is this resonance of continual connection to this center and the form of the cube that has been continued in this center for the longest time. And as we all know, there is a Kaaba here, and there's also the Kaaba in the heavens. And there is a way for us to think about architecture through the cube, just not to think about it in this solid form, but as in the ways I've unfleshed out, which could lead to unique ways for us to understand what is architecture and its relationship to the body and the cosmos. And then I thought, since I'm ending with congregational prayers, nice to end with where congregational prayers are. And you stand within any of these squares right now or rectangles, and think back to some of the things I've said. I think we miss, some of the contact and how our spaces are so differently structured right now in these unique situations that we exist in. Last but not least, almost most of the things or all things that I've said actually is kind of sharing from the thesis I wrote several years ago. And for those of you who are interested to, perhaps read more into it, I put the QR code here. This should send you to the link to the University of Adelaide Library. And you can read the thesis, and if you got any comments, I'd love to hear from you. And with that, I think I've taken too much time. I'll stop here. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh. Alhamdulillah. Thank you, Dr. Faris, for that dars. Alhamdulillah. And yeah, we have Faizan Shah as well joining us for this conversation.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Right, Dr. Faris and Zan, I guess we can continue where Dr. Faris left off and maybe have a conversational kind of element now.
Okay.
Inshallah. Alhamdulillah. Right, okay, so there were a few questions that we asked last week, but because last week, I remember Dr. Faris was talking about, how there is this connectedness between architecture, man, the cosmos, and God. And today, he made reference to how this connectedness is in regards to the Prophet ﷺ. Perhaps Dr. Faris, maybe as a start, could you perhaps kind of elaborate, in terms of, because you did speak about the letters of the Prophet's name, Mim Ha Mim Dal Sallallahu, how is it that we can, kind of further appreciate or understand such wisdom that these scholars have pulled out from the wisdom of the letters, in terms of how they can relate the letters of the Prophet's name with prayer and with architecture? How is it that someone could, have a deeper contemplation and understanding of how their prayer is related to the Prophet ﷺ through this understanding of architecture? Yeah.
Okay. I wish that was a question you would not have asked. And that was a slide I unhit at the last moment. Look, I think on the symbolism of the letters, I can't comment. I don't want to comment because Ibn Arabi is a depth which even scholars ask us to tread very carefully. So I put it as a caution there. And the chapter on the Futuhat, I think he begins with letters, and God knows, the wisdom he was given in relationship to the text. And, just that bit where he spoke about the kun related to the nur in itself, I'm still kind of thinking that through, and I'm struggling with that. So I'm unable to actually expand on that aspect. I'll let Zan tackle this later if need to be, but sorry, Zan. But I think on the question of perhaps, if we have to think architecture through, some of Ibn Arabi's thinking, I think that is possible, right? Because at the end of the day, he speaks about the notion of the center, light, which is both direction and time, right? And having a particular orientation, which is of the different layers I spoke about between man, earth, and God. I mean, these are the founding principles. How anyone would want to interpret this into architecture, I think that's one way to look at it. Sorry, I think that the better answer would be for anyone to draw any sort of wisdom of direction, in reading Ibn Arabi is perhaps to have a question. So for me, it was an architectural question, right? For someone else, could be an ethical question. And perhaps to read with someone who had some experience going through the text, and he's so voluminous and he covers in so many spheres. I believe you'll be able to draw some wisdom through him. Perhaps that's the best answer I could give. Yeah.
Inshallah. Thank you, Dr. Faris. How about Zen?
I think that itself is how we set up the series of lectures here, which is um, somewhat like blatantly saying it is architectural Islam instead of the known Islamic architecture, where it pertains much of the visual or material culture, of which we will cover in the last two parts of the series. But in this example, in this very example, I think Dr. Faris has set up the means of an architectural Islam, and how poetic and how beautiful it is to actually lead back to the Prophet Islam, that everything resonates from him and by him, and even within the letters, yeah, so leave it as that, like unpacking it is a starting point, and if not, is all points pointing back to his very salam being.
Okay, thank you. Now,
Can I add something?
yeah, Bismillah, Doctor.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, the centrality of the Prophet, and I really hope there are people listening to who may think of a thesis or research to look at this, right? Think of how spaces were with the Prophet, you know, how people gathered around him, what space he gave to them, right? Just that, the way he walked or he sat. He was creating different type of spaces, the space he created between himself and his community, between his family, with God in prayer. Uh, and I really like what Zan said. I think uh, this 4 sessions is perhaps to find the means of discussing architectural Islam. And I think there is a good research to be done through the Prophet himself and how he is kind of the paragon or the paradigm to help us think and set up spaces. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, perhaps I
Yeah.
should let you
and
ask.
and I think on a side note as well, I
Yeah.
think even the Hajj and the Umrah is actually resonating around the actions of the Prophet, and we are, and it is a kind of a urban, I mean, in that sense, a gathering and urban and retracing of such events, I think in that sense it is architectural as well, in many ways. Yeah.
Would both of you say that in retracing, or rather retracing the steps of the Hajj and the Umrah, it's like going back to what the Prophet ﷺ taught, in in terms of the movements and the spaces? Is that something you'd say?
I think one of many. I think it's just a side note, but of course, even um, let's say the last sermon and all of that, it is something that we have an image in our mind, and it is something that we carry out in part of a ritual, and there's another part of architecture itself. I think Dr. Faris is setting up the premise, but rituals, effects, memory, and also recollection, it
Mashallah.
is, yes, it
Yes.
is part of our practice, right? So
And the recollection is an interesting thing, right? I think as Zan was talking about it. This
Yeah.
notion of the circle around a
Yeah.
center, uh, I mean, finds relationship in many pre-modern cultures, right? Because when they were looking for the best of designs, they looked at the cosmos, and the cosmos movements were circular, and the circle was the notion of perfection, right? And then when you look at the way the Hajj is performed, right, it's almost like a compass movement rotated from the center again and again and again. So this circularity never ends. It re-emphasizes that. Uh, and then Zan quite wonderfully spoke about the notion of memory. And where
Yeah.
does this memory end? Because uh, the angels have been circumambulating around the Kaaba in the heavens whenever they started circumambulating. So the center and the circle and the compass is just a continual kind of idea that we're just repeating, right? Even at this moment as I'm speaking, it's being repeated again and again and again. So, wow.
MashaAllah, that's very beautiful. I think there are a lot of very interesting things that, like what you mentioned, Dr. Faris. I think if someone were to do a thesis, there's probably a lot of things that they can still explore.
Please, someone do the thesis. When you do the thesis. Yeah. But there's a lot of very good things to be explored. Yeah.
MashaAllah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Perhaps I'm not sure if we could actually go into this, but about the idea of you mentioned about the circumambulating of the Kaaba. Is there any particular architectural theory why it is done in perhaps a certain anti-clockwise rather than clockwise, Doctor?
I don't know. This one I don't. So I've been told to say I don't know when I do. Son might know because he's smiling. I don't. It is a practice of the Prophet and we've kept to it. The science of it. Unless he has explained it and someone knows, that is the wisdom. Yeah. In fact, predates him, right? I mean, because the Hajj is a prophetic lineage. And again, as I mentioned, it is an activity that I think, mirror that of the angels. So there's a kind of, I don't know, there's a kind of knowledge. I'm not privy to it. PhD for someone.
MashaAllah. How about you, Azan? Anything to add on for that?
Not really. I think Faris, it is something that actually we discussed earlier, but we sort of like never had a kind of so we left it at I don't know and let's find out. And I think we're still finding out. But I think, Abu, what you're trying to get at is that this is where we unpack, and this is where I think what drives us to find out how more so of not how come, but where we are at now, and have this actually been spoken about. It maybe have spoken about or written about somewhere else, but it never explicitly being dictated or singled out in architectural texts, at least for our understanding, and that as a driver of forms or a driver of conversation, and I think that's where there is a kind of vacancy there. But nonetheless, there are a lot of texts covering this, and especially the Prophet's Mosque and Kaaba, Mecca itself. But in particularly to look at how Dr. Faris set up, because you can see it is really looking at microcosms, and I think he's just being humble. He's really cutting his slides. He's really cutting his slides.
I'm sure.
And like I said last week, it is really this is a long time calling for this. Even for myself as a student of him, this is a long time calling. And he's really restraining the trigger here.
I just wanted to say, Brother Abu, that that question you asked about anti-clockwise, I believe there's an answer, and we need to go to our great scholars, those with spiritual insight. And I'm sure they have said something about it. But thanks for asking, because I'm not very curious to go and investigate that as well. And again, if I have any clues that I found out, we have 2 more sessions, inshallah.
Inshallah. Because I mean, it's quite interesting, because even when you're running on a track, the track is a anti-clockwise motion. And I'm not too sure, I haven't tried, but if I were to run in a clockwise motion, perhaps, I don't know, it might feel much more difficult than running in an anti-clockwise. Wallahu alam. I really don't know. Yeah.
So Zan, that would be a lecture topic. Why anti-clockwise? But thanks for setting us off the train. We'll see. I will say at least if there's any reference I can draw. Thanks for that. Good question.
All right, Doctor. Right. Actually, next question is it's on the whether there's a hierarchy of meanings, Doctor, in the history of architectural theory, whether could be in Islamic tradition, but could be the other traditions like the Greeks or the other traditions of architectural theorists. Was there, I mean, in Islam, perhaps one could say that the greatest of meanings in architectural theory, the end objective is to know God. But how about the other traditions, like the other kind of theorists? Was there a hierarchy of meanings for them? Like, what was their end goal, their end objective of knowing? Yeah.
So I'm most familiar with pre-modern Western architecture, and
Mhm.
yes, very similar. Uh, if it is not God explicitly spoken about, then it is about higher meaning. But you must understand, most architectural theories written then, they are, I think, core focus was on sacred structures. So within that, there is a hierarchy. So the buildings that are usually spoken about, the kind of forms with which architecture is actually initially thought through is to sacred spaces. And I think I covered this last week as well. Even when you come down to say the palace, etc., there is a kind of a connection, interrelation between uh, sacred space and the space or the seat of the royalty, etc. So absolutely. So I just gave you an example, right? So in traditional church architecture, the churches were expected to be oriented eastwards because Christ was seen as the rising light. And so you can imagine in those days when they did not have electricity. That's why cathedrals have that eye, this large circular window. If you look at what we call Gothic cathedrals or medieval cathedrals, and it's facing eastward. So in the morning when someone is in the church, the eastern light floods in and it changes the atmosphere.
Mashallah.
So, and the Hindu tradition is similar, right? I mean, it's very clear because it's like a mountain, for example, right? But you see, in our tradition, the mosque is not expected to be like a church, moving upwards.
Mhm.
It's not like the Hindu temple, which has to resemble a mountain. Somehow or other, there's a lightness to it. It seems like the predominant feature is how we arrange ourselves in the mosque, pray. And there's one aspect I did not cover. It's the prayer call, which has its own dimensionality about it, which is connected to directions, right, and
Yes.
time as well. So, and also the takbir, right, which the imam
Mashallah.
calls out, and you must appreciate this in a time when there was no other mechanical reproduction of sounds. So it's kind of silent. Can you imagine one person calling out? I don't know how far that would travel, right? So sorry, I'm digress as usual. But
It's
yes,
fine. It's fine. It's interesting.
coming to answer, yes, in pretty modern traditions, architecture was definitely a way, not only just architecture, but even art forms were a way to contemplate existence. I would just leave it.
Mashallah.
Yeah.
Contemplation and existence.
Yeah.
Mashallah. How about you, Hazan? Do you have anything to add on to that? Yep.
Yeah, I think if you look at let's say in the Western tradition, where in particularly looking at how ornamentation was being used, right? From starting from the Greek up to the Roman, and then up to even the Baroque, like just the study of ornamentation, you would actually appreciate how sacred spaces are being created, and there's a somewhat a hierarchy, and this is to differentiate, like I think going back to last week, to differentiate spaces that are sacred and the rest, and sacred spaces also include palaces, and such.
Even
I'm
houses.
losing my face here, yeah, like I'm receding to the background, yeah,
Yes.
and such, yeah.
Yeah, melded into the sacred.
Yep.
How about you, Doctor? You were mentioning something just now.
Oh no, I just said Zan is melded into the sacred.
Yeah, I'm like
Which actually reminds me of the kind of the question last week was about the idea of what is sacred and what is profane. I don't know. It's still roaming around my head on the idea of what
Now,
what constitutes a yeah.
I still owe that answer, and I was again hoping you will not ask the question because I didn't prepare myself. Um, Me and Zan had a conversation about it 2 days back when we met. Um, my recollection is in the pre-modern world, there was not a clear idea of the profane because there was no way a profane can exist because God is in everything. If you understand what I'm trying to get at. It's
Mashallah.
only with modernity where, with the beginnings of science, where truth can now be investigated through other means than scripture, you can start to separate the word of God or the word of God and the world and word that is not God. So something opens up. And the profane may not be quite seen as a negative space. It just becomes what we these days call as a secular space, right? Where you do the other aspects. But as you know, in our tradition, all things that we do is transformed with the intention. So nothing is actually profane, right? You can uplift
Inshallah.
all good activities, right, into a higher dimension altogether. But yes, I owe whoever is listening to and ask the question good answer. So yeah, next week.
Inshallah.
Thank you, everyone.
MashaAllah. I wanted to explore on this question on the idea, because Zan did mention about ornamentals, and I suppose in certain, I would say, the Alhambra, I would say they will use like plants, they will
Yeah.
use perhaps even water, right?
Yeah.
Is there a relation of how they use water and plants and all these? I'm not sure if it's called ornamentals, but these other elements to actually, beautify the architectural space. And is there a certain theory around this? Yeah, since we're on the topic of space and yeah.
Yeah.
Zan, you want to take it down or you want me to?
Yeah, maybe I can start and then you
Yeah.
can pick it off. I think some of these spaces, or known spaces as prototypes, like Alhambra is one, and especially Persian gardens. They are in particular. I think the project there is to mirror paradise. Yeah, it's a mirror of paradise. So a water body is a good example. Using of foliage, natural gardens is actually mirroring the Garden of Eden, and at least their attempt. And I think patronage also plays a role in such civilizations, and you can see that there is a and we're gonna get into that in the weeks to come to eventually look at aesthetics and the role of aesthetics and and the perception of it, right? But this is one example where um, I think beauty could be appreciated in terms of it could be seen as a project as one of them, and I'm just picking out the Persian gardens, for example, as one. Yeah.
And,
Interesting. Yeah.
again, I think Zan's answer, I really can't add much to it. It's not my area of expertise, but met people who have worked on the Mughal gardens as well. And very similar. It is to recreate, or not recreate, but I think it is trying to give an impression of the paradisal garden, of paradise itself. There's a particular geometry to it, and usually in palaces this is celebrated, and one goes into the garden for peace, amongst other things. Um, Ornamentation wise, I believe Zan will pick it up in the next couple of weeks. Again, it's not my expert area. But on the notion of calligraphy, I think that's quite an interesting bit to study as well, because I I definitely know there has been theoretical writings of someone talking about the science of calligraphy and giving instruction. Uh, but I have not seen that perhaps on why other types of ornamentations are built in this way. But I know, Zan, I think the Topkapi scrolls there are also, the geometric forms and how they come about. But I don't think there are actually written theories on how it came about. I think we have some, working drawings, as we call it, of craftsmen working on it. But yeah, as I mentioned last week, nothing wrong with it, because the craftsmen learn from the teacher, who learned from the teacher, and who learned from the teacher. So there was a lineage to that, and I don't think they found it any necessity or it necessary at all for them to actually write it down. It was a tradition that was muscle memory and a kind of a continuity, right, one onto another. Yeah.
MashaAllah. Thank you, both of you. Yeah, for today's lecture, Dr. Faris mentioned about spatial geometry. The next question is on the idea of how these structures were actually engineered themselves. Well, perhaps both of you could jump in and share. Was there any difficulty in building such beautiful spaces like the Alhambra or even other architectural sites that are considered sacred in Islam, like in terms of how they were engineered? I mean, yes, we see it, but we didn't see the process of how it was meticulously done in terms of the carvings or even how it was designed. I don't know, perhaps you could share how they actually built such beautiful architectural sites. Yeah.
So again, I think I have to disappoint the questioner. So as I mentioned, I think the only records I have seen is from Sinan, who actually wrote his text. And then Mehmet Aga, who came after him, who also wrote a text about building. Uh, then, but they don't speak about how to build. I think in the traditional sense, this is how the brick should be cut, should be laid, etc.
Mm.
A lot of it is about describing the magnificence of the structure. That's one thing. But we know for sure that the domes, especially in the Ottoman Empire, the majestic domes, uh, was something that really captured the attention of the Ottomans. And when they went to see the Hagia Sophia, I know they were really impressed, and they wanted to actually use that as a prototype to build mosques after that, right? And we know from even the Christian tradition that when it was built, when it was first built as a, am I right? Zan was a cathedral. It was a,
Yes,
it
yes.
was a cathedral.
Yeah.
There was some stairway put for the patron to climb up and to wander on, almost as cosmos has been built for him, because the vastness of the dome was so overwhelming. Again, we must appreciate, the structure, time and space, and the dome looks like it's floating and it's damn scary, right? So the Muslim architects came after that, Sinan and those who worked with him tried to recreate it, and there were some disasters, and this domes will crash, and it won't be very popular with the person who paid for it, right? Like, I will just leave it at that. Architects may, amongst other things, lose their jobs. But I can speak about that. I think it's an amazing endeavor. And many a times, some of this building will take many, many years to complete. And this was also the case with building cathedrals.
Yes.
And what is amazing, Abu, is just that this architecture has outlasted their patrons, their architects, and has lived for centuries. But we live in a time where buildings are torn down every 25 to 30 years. So there's something about that construction and the way it is holding up. Yeah.
It's quite interesting, Dr. Faris, you mentioned this
Yeah, sure.
because, yes, you're right. I mean, nowadays it's use and throw and the lifespan is so short. But, people who built things in those days, they lasted a lifetime or beyond their lifetimes. That's quite astounding.
And I've got no idea how the structure integrity. You must understand, in those days, right, they did not have the kind of computer software and the knowledge of physics that we have, to talk about how structure stands up, right? And Zan, you can correct me, because even physics, as the way we know it, only came about after the 17th century or even later, and it being applied to buildings. So I don't know how they kind of like estimated it, or I mean, that is not giving them credit. I believe they have a relationship with physics. The origin of the word physics comes from the Greek word physis, Physis or Phusis, which means nature as a living being, right? Nature as a living, I mean, right? I think they had a relationship with building materials and how it would stand itself up, which I think we don't have at the moment.
How about you, Zan? You mentioning something?
I mean, not discounting what they would not know, but I think their relationship with geometry, in fact, if it's just even Pythagorean, it is a basis, and building upon a basis will eventually you can see the outcomes of it, right, lasting centuries, and that I think like I think I mentioned last week, like we to move forward, I think we have to um, sort of like move away from thinking that it is a remnant, or architectural Islam is a remnant of the past, and it's something that it is only of or it belongs to certain centuries. Even if you compare to the Abbasid and the Fatimids, they went through changes of patronage and architecture itself. In fact, they are responding to the times, and I think I've also briefly mentioned that I think Islamic societies at that time were also adaptive like Hagia Sophia, to places of sacredness. So in a kind of way, we are also adapting to the environment, to the built environment in that sense, and sort of like whatever that resonates to the practice, we attributed or contributed it back to the visual and material culture at that time.
So Zan made a very important point. I just want to carry on with that, so there is no misunderstanding. I think my presentation is not an hypothesis that this was how architecture was thought about and eventually became the great mosque that we see across the century. That was not the premise of at least my conversation. I think what I'm trying to get at is there an architectural Islam that within looking at our tradition, right, we can actually start to review architectural vocabulary, perhaps that is hidden. And Azan is absolutely right. If we don't have evidence it was used in the buildings that are already existing, with the knowledge we can draw from our tradition now, how can we make it alive and be useful for architecture moving forward? So history is not a dead letter, but is something that is vivified or given life because we have a new dialogue with it moving forward. Yeah.
MashaAllah. It's quite interesting based on what Dr. Faris is sharing and the conversation with Zan. It's a build-up, throughout the centuries and as time passes by on the knowledge and how they thought about it. And I guess what I'm leading into is, for example, the mosque that I believe was built in part the project of Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, where it's seen as an eco mosque, and the pillars that are actually holding it up, it looks like trees. And Dr. Faris did mention in your lecture just now on trees, on the idea of the archetype of the tree and how this has been related. So it's quite interesting, Dr. Faris. Perhaps you can comment on that, like the idea of using a tree in the vocabulary of looking at architecture in Islam. Yep.
So I again want to emphasize what I mentioned. I'm trying to allude to the idea that there is an architecturalness or architectural vocabulary we can draw from our great intellectual scholars, or the intellectual tradition left behind by our scholars. So that is at least how I've investigated it, how Samar Akash has investigated it, right? Whether this actually had an impact in the way architecture was formed, currently being formed, I do not know. But in the future, if someone explicitly says that they read this text and based on this they develop a space, to perhaps manifest, the ideas in Ibn Arabi, then I can say for sure there is a connection. I've seen that most, at least in the images and the videos, of Dr. Abdul Hakim Murad, right? The great Sheikh, right? But it also hits to me in some other way, Abu, that given his spiritual depth, it almost seems like, yes, that's what he would have designed, or he would have influenced in designing, right? And that's what I was trying to get to, because Samer was able to find in amongst others, especially in the Ibn Arabi, there's a kind of way our scholars and thinkers think about space and the way it should be made, etc. And whether they themselves build it, we don't know. But it just seems that someone with that kind of spiritual insight would think of an architecture or a mosque space in that manner, right? And actually, Zan, I do not know. I don't know what sort of influence he had designing it. I do not know the architect, but it just felt. It's just like a Prof. Naqib al-Attas, right? His influence in building Istak.
Istak, yeah.
Yeah. And Zan will do a thesis on that. Right? And it's worth a study because he's not trained as an architect, right? And the thinking about architecture cannot be left to architects. Let me emphasize that. Ibn Arabi is an architect, but he was not trained in architecture. Let me also emphasize that bit as well, right? Because it is really in the way he visualized the experience of the space, right? And someone like Prof. Naqib, the way he thought about it really kind of like brings so many elements into it. And for sure, no, he had a deep role in how that building was built.
Yeah.
Am I right, Zan? I think it's,
Yes, and he admitted in that as well. It has to be that way, which is very interesting because there is a kind of a prototype that he wanted it. That is the encapsulation of what knowledge is, Islamic knowledge is, and it has to be represented in that form. And I think what Dr. Faris has mentioned thus far in the past 2 weeks, it still um, alludes to prayer and prayer spaces, and eventually leading to mosque. But I think we have not dwelt or touched beyond that. Um, I think because of limitations, but also I think because of the reverence of prayer and the body and the close significance into these spaces. But yes, I think funny that we are speaking about mosque most of the time here. But I think it would extend beyond that. Yeah.
Yeah, if I recall, leading up to what both of you mentioned, or adding on to that, like I think when we were at Istec, yeah, I believe they replicated the Alhambra, right, in terms of the fountains and how it looked like, that replication. Yeah, so I thought it was quite interesting.
I think it's not mere replication. I think it
Mm.
is of the highest homage, because I think his
Mashallah.
book is like illuminated. It is really a
Mashallah.
I think in his own words, a hand in that he wanted to bring in. If knowledge were to be represented, it has to be represented that way and no other way.
yeah.
And that is beautiful itself. This heavy-handedness, but the beauty coming out of it, the craftsman coming out of it, knowing that he's also a master in calligraphy, Islamic calligraphy itself. Uh, that is itself a something to uncover.
If anything, I would say this series of that we're having over the next few weeks, even, it just reveals more of what we don't know, and what both of you mentioned, unpacking the different layers, and a continuation of this timeless wisdom. I believe we've come to the end of the conversation, but I'm sure, inshallah, over the next few more weeks, we can perhaps unpack a little bit more. And perhaps maybe before we end, maybe both of you might want to kind of give your final comments on how we can understand architecture in Islam, and perhaps how we can have a deeper appreciation. I would say a deeper appreciation of whenever we were to visit architectural site. Yeah, is there something both of you like to advise us on? Yeah.
Because Zan is going to speak next week, I'll give him the last words.
Um,
Can I jump? So you can close then, or you want me to close?
no, of course. I think you can have at least finish with
So you go
final
first.
words. Yeah.
Yeah, you go first then. You want to say something?
No, Faris, please, and then maybe yeah.
Um, I think that perhaps the lecture is not so much in the way for us to appreciate existing, what I would call Islamic structures, right?
Okay.
So, I mean, if I may put out there a very controversial point, right? What would make a current modern day mosque so Islamic? I think there's a wonder in that, because I think because the prayer, the space of prayer becomes what it is because the body kind of like comes into it, the sound comes into it, people come into it, it forms all the time. So in reality, the mosque is always overcome with the congregation and the sound, and it's over and beyond the materiality. So I do hope that my talk is not a lens for one to appreciate the great works of art and architecture, because if that's the case, I've done it injustice, because I've not really covered it at all. And there's a vast literature speaking about beauty, ornamentation, which I think Zan may cover in the next couple of weeks, and there's really quite remarkable works out there. I think if anything, I just wanted to, unveil what I would call the potential in our tradition to think about architecture, not the built space in itself.
Inshallah.
And
Mm.
I hope all I was able to show in these two short lectures is there are uh, real depth of works out there, many of them quite unexplored, that allows us to really consider space. And I think you rightfully mentioned just now how to think of our way in space, to think about hierarchies, right? And whether it will end up being a mosque, I think it's secondary. It could be the room today you want to adjust, for example, right?
Yeah.
It could be in an object one creates. Uh, so, and as I mentioned several times in my lecture, and it didn't end architecture, right? In the prayer, which is a kind of a metaphor for a building, one can understand building, cosmos, relationship with the prophet. It's just so multidimensional, right? So yeah, I think that would be my conclusive or concluding words. So the lecture title is very important, is discovering the architectural in the Islam, in Islamic tradition. Yeah.
Inshallah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Done. Thank you.
Zan? Bismillah.
I think just to tie back to what Dr. Faris has covered, it starts with the Prophet ﷺ, and it leads back to him, ﷺ, and I think that's the beauty in it. And I think the onus is upon us to uncover such spaces, and this rediscovering of spaces, this creation of spaces. I think both of us, we are coming from a place and a space that we are not we're not experts on, but we are both uncovering at the same time with the lens of architecture and using it into rediscovering this tracing back onto the beloved, and I think that is something that we can share, and in this sharing, I think it benefits all of us, myself, I'm still learning from my teacher,
Inshallah.
and so
MashaAllah. And whatever that both you mentioned, Dr. Faris and Zan, it reminded me of a line of poetry from this poet, T.S. Eliot. He mentioned, we must never cease in exploration, and the end of all exploration is to return to a place you once were, but know it for the very first time.
So nice.
And it really reminded me of how both of you mentioned about a rediscovery, trying to understand, what the Prophet ﷺ taught us. We're always going back to his teachings in that sense. To really, I try to understand. I mean, you're born into this world, but now you try to discover what's the meaning behind it all. I think it's really beautiful. In fact, I remember another line in poetry. I don't know if it's really from Rumi, because now things from Rumi are said not from him. They say, sell cleverness and buy bewilderment. And what both of you are sharing in terms of how we can appreciate architecture is really to be at awe. Like Zan did mention about the word awe and bewildered, and at this beauty that the cosmos and God. And it's really beautiful. This entire lecture series is very beautiful. And inshallah, we look forward for the next few weeks to continue on this conversation, that rediscovery that we're talking about. And may Allah bless both of you, Dr. Faris and Zan. We look forward, inshallah, to the next lecture. And with that, thank you so much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, both of you. Till next week, inshallah. See both of you, inshallah. Thank you. Allah bless you.
Bye-bye.
Alhamdulillah. Bismillah. All right, alhamdulillah, we've come to the end of yet another very insightful lecture by both Dr. Faris and Zan. And may Allah bless both of them for sharing with us their wisdom and their insights and their understanding of architectural Islam. I believe whatever that they've shared is really something that a lot of us can benefit from. May Allah bless both of them. And before we end, I'd just like to add that this is a continuing series. So every Wednesday of July, we'll have this series. So we have about, I believe, 2 more. So do check out our social media. It's about the same time, Singapore time, 8:30 p.m. And we Saud Lahi would like to extend the invitation for everyone for the Korban in Senegal that we are still striving for. If you'd like to fulfill your Korban rights in Senegal, West Africa, you can go to the link bit.ly/Hajj Africa Korban, bit.ly/Africa Korban. I believe the link is in the description that our volunteers will paste the description link inside. And if you are interested to find out more about our other programs, our other lectures with our scholars and academics like Dr. Faris and Zan, we hope that you can just check out our social media, Instagram and Facebook. Please continue to pray for us, our volunteers who are working behind the scenes, our directors, Brother Khalid and Saida Ainun. And we pray that Allah brings benefit, help everyone through this, and forgive us for any shortcomings. And with that, till next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.